The neighborhood was alive with the muffled hum of laughter, music, and the faint clinking of glasses. It was a Saturday evening, and the air carried the crisp warmth of early autumn, the kind that made you linger just a little longer on your porch or take the long way home. The streetlights bathed the suburban cul-de-sac in a soft golden glow, while the sound of distant footsteps on pavement created a rhythmic backdrop to the night. Layla adjusted the strap of her sequined dress as she walked up the short driveway of a house she had never visited before. She had almost declined the invitation to Diddy's party, an old co-worker she hadn't seen in months, but her roommate, Becca, had insisted. "Come on, it'll be fun," Becca had said earlier that day, holding up 2 dresses for Layla to choose from. "You've been cooped up for weeks. This is exactly what you need." The house stood apart from the others in the neighborhood, a sprawling modern structure with dark wood siding and large floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed warmly from within. It was the kind of house that felt a little too perfect, like it belonged in a magazine rather than a real neighborhood. Layla hesitated on the porch for a moment, adjusting her purse and taking a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. The door swung open almost immediately, and Diddy's familiar grin greeted her. He looked exactly the same as he had when they worked together, polished, confident, and just a little too charming. His shirt was unbuttoned just enough to show off a gold chain, and his cologne hit her before his voice did. "Layla," he said, his arms spreading wide, "I was hoping you'd make it. Get in here." She stepped inside, and the atmosphere hit her like a wave. The house was packed with people, the kind of crowd that was just big enough to feel exciting without being overwhelming. A sleek, minimalist living room opened up into an even sleeker kitchen, where guests were laughing and leaning against the marble countertops. The music was loud but not deafening, a steady pulse of bass that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Layla smiled awkwardly as Diddy handed her a glass of champagne. "You remember Becca, right?" she said, gesturing to her roommate, who was already chatting animatedly with a group of strangers by the bar. "Of course," Diddy said, giving Becca a wave. "Make yourselves at home. There's plenty to drink, and the dance floor's set up in the basement." Layla nodded, taking a cautious sip of her drink as she stepped further into the house. The energy was infectious, even for someone like her who preferred quieter nights. She found herself relaxing, letting the atmosphere wash over her as she moved through the crowd. The night unfolded slowly, filled with the usual moments that made up a party. Introductions to people she'd forget by morning, awkward small talk that sometimes turned into genuine laughs, and the occasional glances at her phone to check the time. Becca disappeared almost immediately, swept up in a game of pool downstairs, leaving Layla to wander on her own. She found herself gravitating toward the quieter corners of the house, where the noise dulled and the conversations felt more subdued. The upstairs hallway, for instance, was nearly empty, its dim lighting and plush carpeting a welcome contrast to the chaos below. She passed a series of closed doors, her heels sinking softly into the carpet as she explored. At the far end of the hall was a door that stood slightly ajar, spilling a sliver of light onto the floor. Layla hesitated, her curiosity piqued. She wasn't one to snoop, but the soft glow drew her closer, and she peeked inside. It was a small room, furnished with a single armchair and a low coffee table. On the table sat a collection of candles, their flames flickering softly, and an old, ornate mirror that leaned against the wall. The mirror caught her attention immediately. It was tall and gilded, the kind of antique that looked completely out of place in a house like this. Something about it made her stomach twist, though she couldn't say why. "Layla," a voice called from down the hall, breaking her trance. She turned quickly to see Becca's head poking out from the staircase. "What are you doing up here? Come back down. Diddy's about to do some kind of toast." The party was in full swing, the music louder and the crowd looser. Becca grabbed her arm and led her to the center of the living room, where Diddy stood on a makeshift stage, a glass of champagne raised high. His grin was wider now, almost predatory, as he scanned the crowd. "To the night," he shouted, his voice ringing above the music, "and to all of you for making it unforgettable." The crowd cheered, glasses clinking as the toast echoed through the house. Layla smiled, but some. The next morning, the remnants of the party lingered like an aftertaste. Empty champagne flutes sat abandoned on marble countertops. Glitter from someone's dress clung to the floor, and faint impressions of voices and laughter seemed to hang in the air. Layla sat at the small breakfast nook in her apartment, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee as sunlight streamed through the window. Becca was still asleep, sprawled across the couch in the living room, her phone clutched in one hand and a faint snore escaping her lips. Lila stared at her phone, scrolling through the pictures she had taken the night before. Most of them were blurry, snaps of smiling faces mid-laugh or a poorly lit shot of Diddy mid-toast. But there was one photo that made her pause. It was from upstairs, just before she had found Becca in the hallway. The image showed the door to the small room, slightly ajar, with a sliver of flickering light spilling out. She didn't remember taking it, and the realization made her skin prickle. She set the phone down and tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had crept into her chest. It was just a photo, a stray click of the camera, nothing to dwell on. But as the day unfolded, the sensation didn't leave her. It lingered in the quiet moments, in the way the apartment felt a little too still, or the way her coffee mug seemed colder than it should have been despite the warmth of the drink. Lila distracted herself with errands, wandering through the aisles of a nearby grocery store, her cart full of things she didn't necessarily need. Even in the bright fluorescence of the store, she felt it, a vague, nagging sense that she was being watched. That night, Becca invited her to watch a movie. The lights were dim, the sound of the TV filling the small living room with muffled dialogue and dramatic music. Becca was engrossed, her legs curled under a blanket as she nibbled on popcorn. But Lila found her attention drifting. Her thoughts kept returning to the party, to the strange, misplaced memory of standing in front of that gilded mirror upstairs. It was just a mirror, she told herself again, but something about it had felt wrong, as though it didn't quite belong in the house, or in reality. "Earth to Lila," Becca said, waving a hand in front of her face. "You okay? You've been staring at the TV for like 10 minutes, but I'm pretty sure you haven't blinked." "Yeah, I'm fine," Lila said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Becca raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. She turned back to the movie, tossing a piece of popcorn into her mouth, but the air between them felt heavier now, like Becca had noticed the tension Lila was trying so hard to hide. That night, Lila's dreams were restless. She saw flashes of the party, the crowd of smiling faces blurring together, their laughter echoing unnaturally. Diddy stood on his makeshift stage, his grin impossibly wide, and behind him, the mirror loomed, its surface rippling like water. Lila felt herself being drawn toward it, her feet moving against her will. The closer she got, the more the reflection shifted. It wasn't just her reflection staring back. There were others, shapes and shadows that writhed and reached for her, their movements jerky and unnatural. She woke with a start, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights outside her window. She sat up, running a hand through her hair, and tried to steady her breathing. It was just a dream. But as she looked around the room, her eyes caught on her closet door. It was open, just a crack, but she was certain she had closed it before going to bed, Diddy refused to cooperate. Instead, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and forced herself to look away. The next morning, she tried to bring it up casually while Becca was pouring coffee. "Do you ever feel like something's off?" Lila asked, her voice light but tentative. Becca glanced up, her brow furrowed. "Off how?" "I don't know," Lila said, shrugging. "Like, at the party. Did anything seem weird to you?" Becca tilted her head, considering. "I mean, Diddy's parties are always kind of weird. Everyone trying to outdo each other, acting like they're in a movie or something." "Why?" Lila hesitated. "It's probably nothing. That room upstairs. Did you see it? The one with the mirror?" Becca frowned. "What mirror?" "You know," Lila said, her voice growing quieter. "The one at the end of the hall." Becca shook her head, setting her mug down. "I don't remember any mirror. Are you sure you weren't imagining it?" The casual dismissal made Lila's stomach twist. She nodded quickly, not wanting to press further. But the sense of unease only deepened. Later that day, as she went through her phone again, she escaped. The following week passed slowly, each day carrying the same mundane rhythm Lila had grown accustomed to. Work, errands, dinner with Becca. It all unfolded with an ordinary kind of predictability. Yet, beneath the surface, a persistent sense of unease gnawed at her. It wasn't anything overt, nothing she could point to and say, "This is why I feel this way." It was more like an itch she couldn't reach, a vague awareness that something in her life wasn't quite right. One evening, Lila came home to find Becca sprawled out on the couch, her laptop open and a half-eaten bowl of cereal resting precariously on the armrest. The soft glow of the screen lit up her face as she scrolled, her expression a mix of boredom and mild interest. "Long day?" Lila asked, dropping her bag on the counter. "Always," Becca replied, not looking up. "Diddy's been texting me all afternoon about another party he's planning. Apparently, it's going to be bigger than the last one." Lila paused, her stomach tightening. "Did you say yes?" Becca shrugged. "Not yet." "Why? You thinking about going?" Lila hesitated, the memory of the upstairs hallway and the flickering light fresh in her mind. "I'm not sure," she said carefully. "That last one, it felt weird, didn't it?" Becca finally looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Weird how?" Lila searched for the right words, but they didn't come. Just something about the house. It felt off. Becca rolled her eyes and turned back to her screen. "Lila, it's just Diddy. He's harmless. The guy probably just gets his houses off some reality show or something. You're overthinking it." Maybe she was. But even as Lila nodded and forced a smile, she couldn't shake the nagging sensation that her friend was wrong. The first real sign that something was wrong came a few days later. Lila was cleaning her room, her headphones in, the soft hum of a podcast filling the space. She was halfway through folding a pile of laundry when she noticed something odd. The closet door was ajar. She stared at it for a moment, trying to remember if she had left it open. She was meticulous about her space, and it wasn't like her to leave things out of place. Tentatively, she walked over and nudged it open the rest of the way. Her clothes hung neatly in a row, shoes lined up on the floor. Nothing seemed out of order. But there was a faint smell, something metallic, like old coins or rust. She stepped back, her nose wrinkling. The smell dissipated as quickly as it had come, leaving her with a lingering sense of unease. Shaking her head, she closed the door firmly and returned to her laundry. The next morning, it happened again. This time, the door wasn't just ajar, it was wide open. Layla stared at it from her bed, her heart beating a little faster. She had locked it the night before, She was sure of it. She walked over and pulled it shut, testing the latch to make sure it was secure. The faint metallic smell was there again, just for a moment, before it faded. That evening, Becca noticed her fidgeting with her coffee mug and raised an eyebrow. "You okay?" Lila hesitated. "Do you ever feel like something's watching you?" Becca laughed. "Like, in general? Or are you talking about something specific?" Lila smiled weakly. "Forget it. It's nothing." Becca shrugged and returned to her phone, but Lila's thoughts lingered. That night, as she lay in bed, she kept glancing at the closet door. It stayed shut, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was just on the other side. The following weekend, Diddy texted her directly. The message was short and casual. "Hope you're coming to the next party. We'll have even more surprises this time." Layla stared at her phone, debating whether to reply. Before she could decide, another notification popped up. It was a calendar alert. Meeting at 10 p.m. She frowned. She hadn't scheduled anything for that time. She opened the app, but the entry was blank, just like the one from weeks ago. Dismissing it, she set her phone down and tried to focus on her book, but the unease settled over her like a heavy blanket. The next day, Becca was unusually quiet at breakfast. She stared into her cereal, her spoon moving absently as though she wasn't really eating. Layla watched her for a moment before speaking. "Everything okay?" Becca looked up, her expression distant. "Yeah, just weird dreams." "About what?" Becca hesitated. "I don't know. It's hard to explain. Something about a hallway. There was a door, and it kept opening." Lila felt a chill run down her spine. "Becca, do you think—" Before she could finish, Becca's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and sighed. "It's Diddy again. He wants me to come by early to help set up. Guess that means we're going." Lila didn't argue, but the pit in her stomach deepened. As she cleared the table, her mind kept drifting to the flickering light, the mirror, and the strange sensation that had followed her ever since. The next morning was sluggish, the kind of day where the air felt heavy and time seemed to drag. Lila woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the blinds, her body aching with the weight of restless sleep. Becca was already gone, a note on the kitchen counter saying she'd gone to meet Diddy for the party prep. Lila poured herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, the steam curling up lazily as she stared out at the street. A group of kids rode their bikes past the apartment building, their laughter faint but familiar, grounding her in the mundane normalcy of the day. But even as she watched the world move on outside, the nagging feeling of unease clung to her like a second skin. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from Diddy. "You're coming tonight, right?" She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A part of her wanted to say no, to excuse herself with some vague reason and spend the evening safely at home. But another part, one she couldn't fully explain, felt compelled to go. It was as if the night itself was pulling her toward something she didn't fully understand. "Yeah," she typed back, her stomach twisting as she hit send. The day passed slowly, her thoughts circling back to the strange events of the past week. The closet door, the smudged handprint on the mirror, the flicker of something in her peripheral vision that was never there when she turned to look. None of it made sense, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it was all connected somehow. By late afternoon, she decided to distract herself with errands. The grocery store was busy, the aisles crowded with people preparing for the weekend. Lila moved through the rows mechanically, tossing items into her cart without much thought. She turned a corner and nearly collided with an older woman who gave her a sharp look before hurrying past. "Sorry," Lila muttered, more to herself than the woman. But as she pushed her cart When she finally left the store, the sun was beginning to set, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The colors should have been comforting, but instead, they felt ominous, like the day was holding its breath. That evening, Becca returned just as Lila was finishing dinner. She looked tired but excited, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. "You should see the setup," Becca said, dropping her bag on the floor and grabbing a water bottle from the fridge. "Diddy's gone all out this time. There's even this creepy old mirror he brought in for decoration." Lila froze. "A mirror?" "Yeah," Becca said, taking a long sip of water. "It's huge, like antique store huge. He put it in the living room, right by the windows. It's actually kind of cool, if you're into that haunted house vibe." Lila's stomach churned. She didn't know what she'd been expecting, but hearing about the mirror confirmed what she had feared. "Did he say where he got it?" Becca shrugged. "No idea. Probably some estate sale. You know how he loves his eccentric antiques. Why?" "Just curious," Lila said, forcing a smile. But her mind was racing. By the time they arrived at Diddy's house, the party was already in full swing. Music thumped from inside, the bass line vibrating through the ground as they walked up the driveway. The house was lit up like a beacon, every window glowing with warm light, but Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was waiting within. Diddy greeted them at the door, his usual charm on full display. "Lila, Becca, glad you could make it." Becca immediately disappeared into the crowd, leaving Layla standing awkwardly in the foyer. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on the mirror almost immediately. It was just as Becca had described, massive, with an ornate gold frame that gleamed in the light of the chandeliers. It stood near the far wall, angled slightly so that it reflected the partygoers in distorted, shimmering fragments. Lila felt her pulse quicken as she approached it. Up close, the mirror was even more unsettling. The surface was polished to perfection, but something about it seemed off. The reflections moved a little too slowly, like they were lagging behind reality by just a fraction of a second. "Creepy, huh?" Diddy's voice startled her, and she turned to see him grinning at her. "Found it at an auction. Thought it would be perfect for tonight." "Where was the auction?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Some old estate a few towns over," he said with a shrug. "Why, you like it?" "It's interesting," she said carefully. Diddy laughed. "You're not the first to say that, but hey, it's a conversation piece." He moved on, leaving Lila standing alone in front of the mirror. Lila blinked, her eyes fixed on the mirror. The hallway in the reflection was unfamiliar, its dim light casting soft shadows on worn wooden floors. The door at the end creaked open slightly, the movement agonizingly slow. She turned her head to look behind her, expecting to see some kind of optical trick or hidden corridor, but all that greeted her was the lively party. People danced and laughed, oblivious to the unsettling image in the mirror. She swallowed hard and looked back at the glass, but the hallway was gone. The mirror now reflected the room as it should, with partygoers milling about and a string of fairy lights glinting off the surface. Lila's heart thudded in her chest, her palms slick with sweat as she stepped back, bumping into someone. "Whoa, you okay?" Becca's voice pulled her out of her spiraling thoughts. Her friend steadied her, a slight frown creasing her brow. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Lila said quickly, her voice shaky. I think I need some air." Becca studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Want me to come with you?" "No, it's okay. I just need a minute." Lila forced a small smile and moved toward the back patio, her hands trembling as she pushed open the glass door. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the energy inside. String lights hung from the pergola, casting a warm glow over the patio furniture and a small fountain trickling softly in the corner. Lila sat down on one of the chairs, her hands gripping the edge of the armrests as she tried to steady her breathing. It didn't make sense. She hadn't imagined it. The hallway, the door. She had seen it, clear as day. But how and why? She closed her eyes, trying to make sense of the images swirling in her mind. The faint sound of the fountain grew louder, breaking through her thoughts. It wasn't just water anymore. It sounded deeper, almost like a low hum. Layla opened her eyes and looked toward the fountain. The soft light of the patio cast long shadows, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement in the water, as if something was stirring just beneath the surface. Her breath caught. She leaned forward, squinting to get a better look. The water rippled unnaturally, small waves lapping against the edges of the fountain, as though disturbed by something unseen. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stilled, the surface perfectly smooth. Lila sat back, her pulse quickening. Every instinct told her to leave, to grab Becca and walk out the door without looking back. But the thought of trying to explain herself, of sounding paranoid or worse, crazy, held her in place. She stayed on the patio a little longer, her eyes darting between the fountain and the glowing windows of the house. When she finally went back inside, the party felt different. The music seemed slower, almost distorted, though no one else seemed to notice. Lila made her way through the crowd, searching for Becca. She found her near the kitchen, laughing with a group of people Lila didn't recognize. "There you are," Becca said, her smile bright. "Feeling better?" Lila nodded, though her stomach still churned with unease. "Yeah, are you ready to go soon?" Becca raised an eyebrow. "Already? It's barely midnight." I don't feel great," Lila admitted. She hated being the one to cut the night short, but the longer she stayed, the heavier the atmosphere seemed to grow. Becca frowned but nodded. "Okay, let me grab my stuff." As Becca turned to gather her things, Lila felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She turned instinctively, her eyes scanning the room. The mirror stood across the way, its gilded frame catching the light. She couldn't stop herself from looking at it, her gaze drawn to its surface like a magnet. At first, it showed the room as it was, a crowded living space filled with people. But then, slowly, the reflection shifted. The faces of the partygoers blurred, their movements slowing until they stopped entirely. In the reflection, the room emptied, leaving only Lila standing alone. Her chest tightened, panic rising like a tide. She blinked hard, trying to break the spell, but when she opened her eyes, the reflection had changed again. The hallway was back, the door at the end swinging open fully now. From the darkness beyond, something began to emerge. A figure, indistinct but undeniably there. "Lila." Becca's voice snapped her out of her trance. She turned to see her friend standing beside her, a concerned look on her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Lila said quickly, her voice strained. "Let's just go." Becca hesitated, but didn't argue. They made their way to the front door, weaving through the crowd. As they stepped outside, Lila felt the tension in her chest ease slightly, though the images from the mirror lingered in her mind. She didn't look back as they walked down the driveway, the cool night air wrapping around them like a balm. But even as they reached the sea, the following morning arrived with the kind of quiet stillness that always made Lila feel uneasy. The world outside seemed muted, as though it were waiting for something to happen. She sat at the small table by the window, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, watching as pale sunlight struggled to break through the gray clouds. Becca was still asleep, her bedroom door shut tight. The faint sound of her soft snores reached Lila's ears, a grounding reminder that, for now, everything was normal. Yet, as Lila stared out at the street, her thoughts kept circling back to the mirror, the hallway, the figure that had started to emerge. She rubbed her temples, willing the memories away. It's just my imagination, she thought, though the words felt hollow. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention. It was a text from Diddy. Hope you made it home okay last night. Fun party, huh? She hesitated before replying. Yeah, thanks for having us. Great setup. A few moments later, another buzz. The mirror was the star, don't you think? Her stomach twisted. The message felt loaded somehow, as if he knew something she didn't. She typed out a quick response. It's definitely unique. Diddy didn't reply, and she set her phone down, trying to focus on the day ahead. There were chores to do, errands to run, the usual tasks that kept her grounded. She told herself to stop thinking about the mirror, about the reflection that hadn't made sense. But as the day wore on, it became increasingly difficult. Later that afternoon, while Becca was out meeting friends, Layla decided to tidy the apartment. The act of organizing usually helped her clear her head. She worked her way from room to room, vacuuming, dusting, and rearranging small items on shelves. When she reached her bedroom, she noticed something strange. The closet door, always shut, was slightly ajar. She froze, her pulse quickening. I closed that, she murmured to herself. For a moment, she stood motionless, staring at the dark gap. Nothing moved. Slowly, she stepped forward and pushed the door open fully. Her clothes hung neatly on their hangers, her shoes lined up at the bottom. Everything seemed normal, but that faint metallic smell was there again, faint but unmistakable. Lila backed away, her hand still on the doorframe. The air felt heavier, colder, and she couldn't explain why. Shaking her head, she forced herself to shut the door firmly and continue cleaning. But the feeling of being watched lingered, prickling at the back of her neck. By the time Becca returned, the apartment was spotless, but Lila's nerves were frayed. Becca walked in carrying a bag of takeout, her cheerful energy filling the room. Hey, you've been busy, she said, setting the food down on the counter. Are we celebrating something? Just needed to clear my head, Lila replied, her voice quieter than usual. Becca frowned, taking a closer look at her. You okay? You've been acting off. Lila hesitated. She wanted to tell her about the closet, about the feeling that something was wrong, but she knew how it would sound. I'm fine, she said instead, forcing a smile. Just tired. Becca didn't look convinced, but she let it go, opening the takeout bags and arranging the food on plates. They ate together in the living room, the TV playing quietly in the background. The conversation was light, but Lila's mind kept drifting. That night, Layla lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. She had left the closet light on, a small comfort, though she hated to admit it. The metallic smell was gone, but her unease remained. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and then, just as she was beginning to drift off, a faint creak broke the silence. Her eyes snapped open. It was coming from the closet. Lila's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned her head slowly, her eyes fixing on the closet door. The light she had left on was now dim, flickering faintly, as though something were interfering with it. For a long moment, she didn't move. The creak came again, followed by a soft rustling sound. It was so quiet, she could almost convince herself she was imagining it. Almost. Summoning her courage, Layla sat up, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling. There was no response. The room was silent again, save for the faint hum of the street outside. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. Every step toward the closet felt like a battle, her body screaming at her to turn back. When she reached the door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. With a deep breath, she yanked the door open. The light flickered once more before going out entirely, plunging the closet into darkness. Her clothes swayed gently on their hangers, as though the morning light crept into the room slowly, casting long shadows across the walls. Layla sat at the edge of her bed, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. Her body felt heavy, her mind sluggish from the sleepless night. The closet door was still shut, and she had shoved a chair against it as a precaution before dawn. The action felt childish in the moment, but now she wasn't so sure. The apartment was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every small sound, pipes groaning, the hum of the refrigerator, seem amplified. Becca had left earlier for work, her usual chatter about weekend plans now a faint memory. Layla barely remembered nodding at her goodbye. The tea cooled in her hands as she stared blankly at the muted TV. It played some morning talk show, the hosts laughing and gesturing with mugs of coffee in hand. Their energy felt completely disconnected from the weight in her chest, as if they belonged to a different world entirely. She took a slow sip, the warmth doing little to settle her nerves. Her eyes kept flickering toward the closet, despite her best efforts to focus on anything else. The chair braced against the door didn't move, but in her mind, she kept imagining it slowly sliding away on its own. By mid-afternoon, Layla decided she needed to leave the apartment. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside, the crisp autumn air biting against her skin. The sidewalks were dotted with fallen leaves, their crunch underfoot grounding her in the moment. The city was alive with the usual bustle, cars honking in the distance, people chatting as they passed by, but it all felt muted, like a dull roar in the background. She wandered aimlessly for a while, letting the motion distract her from the gnawing unease. Eventually, she found herself in front of a small coffee shop. It wasn't one she usually went to, but the soft light spilling from the windows felt inviting. She stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, and for the first time that day, she felt a sliver of comfort. She ordered a latte and sat at a corner table, pulling out her phone to scroll mindlessly while she waited. The mundane distraction was welcome, but her mind kept drifting back to the previous night. The way the closet light had flickered, the faint rustling, the whisper of her name. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe she was making connections where there weren't any. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The barista called her name, and she stood to grab her drink. As she returned to her table, she noticed an older man sitting a few tables away. He was staring at her, his eyes sharp and unblinking. She offered a polite nod, but he didn't react, his gaze fixed intently on her. Unsettled, she returned to her seat and turned her body slightly, trying to block him from view. She sipped her latte and focused on her phone, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After a few minutes, she glanced back toward the man. He was gone. The chair he had been sitting in was empty, the table cleared. Layla's stomach tightened, a cold prickle running down her spine. She scanned the room, but there was no sign of him. Shaking her head, she tried to dismiss it as a trick of her tired mind. When Layla returned home, the apartment was still. The chair remained braced against the closet door, just as she had left it, muscles relaxing slightly. Maybe she'd been overreacting. Maybe a good night's sleep was all she needed to feel normal again. She spent the evening cleaning, hoping the activity would tire her out enough to sleep. She dusted shelves, vacuumed the floors, and reorganized the cabinets. By the time she finished, the apartment looked pristine, but her nerves were no more settled. Later, as she got ready for bed, she avoided looking at the closet entirely. She turned off the lights and climbed under the covers, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. For a while, all was quiet. The hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of a clock were the only sounds. But then, just as her body began to relax, she heard it again. A faint creak. Her breath hitched, her eyes snapping open. The sound was soft but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the closet. She lay perfectly still, her body rigid, listening intently. Another creak followed, then a gentle tap, like fingers brushing against wood. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to turn her head toward the closet. The door was still shut, the chair still braced against it, but the sound continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as though something on the other side was testing the barrier. "Becca," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She knew Becca wasn't home, but saying the name felt late. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow. It should have been comforting, but Lila felt none of the usual calm that mornings brought. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the closet door. It was still closed, the chair still pressed firmly against it, but the events of the night before lingered in her mind like a thick fog. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping her out of her thoughts. She reached for it, her hand trembling slightly. It was a message from Becca. "Grabbing coffee with Diddy before work. Want anything?" Lila stared at the message for a moment before typing back a quick reply. "No, I'm good. Thanks." She set the phone down and ran a hand through her hair. Becca's easygoing attitude made everything feel more normal, like last night's whispers and creaks were just bad dreams. But deep down, she knew they weren't. By mid-morning, Lila was sitting at the small dining table with a bowl of cereal, scrolling through her emails. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the whisper. Her name, spoken softly, almost tenderly. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of the closet door had been testing her. The metallic scent lingered faintly in the air, almost unnoticeable unless she really concentrated. She had tried airing out the room earlier, opening the windows wide to let in fresh air, but it didn't help. It clung stubbornly, like an unwelcome guest. Her phone buzzed again, startling her. She reached for it and saw another message from Becca. "Diddy says he's planning another party next weekend. Should we go?" Lila hesitated. The thought of going back to that house made her stomach twist, but she also didn't want to let her fears control her. She typed back slowly. "Maybe. Let me think about it." She stared at the screen for a moment after hitting send, then set the phone aside. The day stretched out ahead of her, filled with chores she didn't feel like doing, and an unease she couldn't shake. That afternoon, Lila went out for a walk. The crisp autumn air and the crunch of leaves underfoot offered some relief, pulling her out of the stifling atmosphere of the apartment. She wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood, letting the sights and sounds distract her. Children played in yards, their laughter mingling with the faint hum of distant traffic. It was all so ordinary, so painfully normal, that it almost made her believe everything was fine. But as she turned a corner and found herself on a quieter street, a sudden chill ran down her spine. as if no one had lived in them for years. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her steps quickened, her eyes darting to the shadows between the houses. Nothing moved, but the sensation didn't fade. She stopped in front of an old brick house, its shutters crooked and paint peeling. The front yard was overgrown, the grass thick and unruly. A single swing hung from a tree branch, swaying slightly in the breeze. As Lila stared at it, she noticed something in one of the upper windows. A figure, faint and indistinct, standing just behind the curtain. Her breath caught. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Shaking her head, she turned and walked quickly back toward the main road. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the unease lingered, curling around her like smoke. By the time she returned home, the apartment felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. She kicked off her shoes and set her keys on the counter, glancing toward the closet door out of habit. The chair was still there, unmoved. She exhaled softly, trying to shake the tension that had built up during her walk. The rest of the evening passed uneventfully. Lila made herself a simple dinner and settled on the couch to watch a movie. She kept the lights on, though, even as the sun set and the apartment grew dim. The movie played, its cheerful tone a stark contrast to the weight in her chest, but it was enough to keep her distracted for a while. It wasn't until she went to bed that the tension returned. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom, staring at the closet. The chair felt like a flimsy barrier now, something that offered the illusion of safety rather than the real thing. She debated moving it, opening the door to prove to herself that nothing was there, but the thought made her stomach twist. Instead, she climbed into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint ticking of her clock. She closed her eyes, willing herself to relax. Minutes passed. The silence grew heavier. And then, just as she was beginning to drift off, she heard it again. A faint creak, followed by the soft rustle of fabric. Her eyes snapped open. The knock lingered in the air, soft but deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was behind the closet door was testing her reaction. Lila froze, her breath caught in her throat, her fingers gripping the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned white. She stared at the door, at the slight angle of the chair braced against it, willing it not to move again. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Nothing happened. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and forced herself to sit up. Her heart pounded so loudly, she could hear it echoing in her ears. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, her hand trembling as she unlocked the screen. The clock read 3:17 a.m. The world outside was still, bathed in the deep quiet that only existed in the dead of night. Her thumb hovered over Becca's contact. She wanted to call, to hear her friend's voice, but what would she even say? That her closet was knocking, that she was scared of shadows and whispers. Becca would come, of course, but Lila wasn't ready to share the weight of this. Not yet. She set the phone down and stared at the closet again. The room was silent now, the air heavy and thick, like the moments after a thunderstorm. The chair hadn't moved any further. Maybe she'd imagined the sound. Maybe it had been a branch tapping against the window, or the building settling. The excuses sounded hollow, even in her own mind. Taking a deep breath, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood. Her feet were cold against the hardwood floor as she crossed the room. Each step felt impossibly loud, the creak of the floorboards sending shivers up her spine. When she reached the chair, she hesitated. Her hand hovered over the backrest, her pulse racing. She didn't want to move it. The thought of opening the closet door made her stomach twist, but she also couldn't leave it like this. Slowly, She slid the chair to the side, wincing at the faint scrape of wood against wood. The door remained closed. Lila reached out, her hand trembling as she gripped the doorknob. The metal was cold under her fingers. She turned it slowly, the sound of the latch clicking echoing in the quiet room. She pulled the door open just a crack, peering inside. The closet was dark, the overhead light off. Her clothes hung neatly, undisturbed, and the faint scent of lavender from an old sachet drifted out. She stared for a moment longer, her breath shaky but steadying. There was nothing there, no shadows, no whispers, just her belongings, still and ordinary. Letting out a soft laugh at her own nerves, Lila shut the door firmly and slid the chair back into place. She climbed back into bed, her body heavy with exhaustion. As she settled under the covers, she told herself it was over, that she could finally sleep. The next morning, the world felt brighter, lighter, as though the night's tension had been nothing more than a bad dream. Layla sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through social media on her phone. Becca was on the couch, still in her pajamas, scrolling through her own phone and humming softly to herself. "I was thinking," Becca said, breaking the comfortable silence. "We should do something fun tonight. Go out, get drinks, something to shake off this weird energy." Lila looked up, considering the offer. "Yeah, maybe. I think I could use a distraction." "Good," Becca smiled. "I'll text a few people and see who's in." Lila nodded, sipping her coffee as Becca returned to her phone. The idea of going out felt appealing, a chance to leave the apartment and the lingering unease behind. But as the day wore on, small things began to nag at her. It started with her laundry. As she folded a pile of clothes, she noticed one of her sweaters was missing. She searched the closet, the drawers, even the laundry basket, but it was nowhere to be found. She told herself she must have misplaced it, though she couldn't shake the feeling that it had been there just the day before. Later, as she was washing dishes, she thought she heard faint tapping coming from the bedroom. She paused, her hands submerged in soapy water, and listened. The sound stopped as soon as she focused on it, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator in the background. She shook her head and returned to the dishes, trying to dismiss the noise as a creak in the floorboards or the wind outside. By evening, Layla had all but convinced herself that she was overthinking things. She dressed in a simple black top and jeans, ready to meet Becca's friends at a bar downtown. As she was about to leave, her phone buzzed with a message from Diddy. "Don't forget about the party next weekend. The mirror will be waiting." She stared at the message, her stomach tightening. She hadn't said yes to the party yet, hadn't even mentioned the mirror to Diddy. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure how to respond. Becca's voice broke through her thoughts. "Ready?" Lila pocketed her phone, forcing a smile. The week passed, with an unnerving mix of normalcy and discomfort, each day bringing with it small but undeniable reminders that something wasn't right. Lila went through her routines, making coffee in the morning, scrolling through emails, meeting Becca for late-night TV marathons, but she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It was subtle at first, like the faintest prickle at the back of her neck or the fleeting sense that someone had just left the room. The apartment itself seemed to amplify her unease. The once familiar creaks of the floorboards now felt deliberate, as though the house itself was alive and listening. Shadows seemed to linger a little longer than they should, pooling in the corners of rooms even when the lights were on. Lila told herself it was just her imagination, that the late nights and lack of sleep were catching up to her. But the excuses rang hollow. On Wednesday evening, Becca came home with takeout and a bundle of energy, her presence a welcome distraction. She kicked off her shoes and plopped onto the couch, unpacking containers containers of Chinese food with a flourish. "You've been quiet this week," Becca said, handing Lila a pair of chopsticks. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Lila said, though her voice lacked conviction. She poked at her food, avoiding Becca's gaze. "Come on, I know you." Becca leaned in, her tone softening. "Is it about the party? Or something else?" Lila hesitated. She wanted to tell Becca about the whispers, the knocking, the text from Diddy that felt too personal. But saying it out loud would make it real, and she wasn't ready for that. Instead, she forced a smile. "It's nothing. Just stressed, I guess." Becca didn't look convinced, but she let it go, turning her attention to the TV. Lila joined her, the glow of the screen casting flickering shadows across the room. For a while, it felt normal, comfortable even. But as the night wore on, the shadows began to feel oppressive. Lila kept glancing at the hallway, half expecting to see something moving just out of sight. The next morning, the apartment was quiet. Becca had left early for a meeting, leaving Lila alone with her thoughts. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steaming mug of coffee in her hands. The light streaming through the window felt colder than usual, its warmth muted by the gray clouds outside. A soft creak broke the silence. Layla's head snapped toward the sound. It was coming from the hallway, the faint groan of wood shifting under weight. She set her mug down, her pulse quickening as she rose from the chair. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing slightly in the stillness. No response. She stepped into the hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. The apartment felt larger somehow, as though the walls had stretched overnight. She glanced at the closet door, still shut tight with the chair braced against it. The sight of it should have been comforting, but it wasn't. As she turned to head back to the kitchen, her eyes caught on something strange. One of the picture frames on the wall was slightly crooked, tilted at an angle that hadn't been there before. She reached out to straighten it, but her hand stopped halfway. The glass wasn't reflecting her properly. Her reflection was there, but it was wrong. Her face was too still, her eyes slightly off-center, staring past her instead of at her hand. She jerked her arm back, the motion breaking the spell, and the reflection snapped back to normal. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow as she backed away from the frame. She grabbed her phone from the counter and texted Becca. "Something feels off. Can you come home early?" The three dots appeared, then disappeared, leaving her staring at the screen in frustration. She set the phone down and tried to calm herself, but the memory of her distorted reflection lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. That evening, Becca returned with groceries and an apologetic smile. "Sorry, got caught up at work. You okay?" Lila nodded, though the tension in her shoulders hadn't eased. She helped Becca unpack, grateful for the distraction. They spent the night cooking and talking about mundane things, weekend plans, a new restaurant Becca wanted to try, a funny story from her office. For a while, it felt like everything was normal again. But as the night deepened, the unease returned. The apartment felt too quiet, the usual hum of city noise muffled as though the world outside had vanished. Layla found herself glancing at the picture frame, half expecting to see her reflection staring back at her with those two still eyes. When they finally went to bed, Lila lay awake for hours, her thoughts churning. Just as she began to drift off, she heard it again, the faint creak of wood, followed by a soft, rhythmic tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from the hallway. The next few days passed in a blur of restless nights and strained mornings. Lila tried to cling to her routines, making coffee, folding laundry, answering emails. But each task felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to tether herself to normalcy. Becca small comforts, a favorite snack, an invite to watch a show, or a casual joke to lighten the mood. It helped, but only briefly. The tapping in the hallway hadn't returned, but the silence it left in its wake was worse. It stretched through the apartment, heavy and watchful, making Lila jump at every creak of the floorboards or distant hum of traffic. One morning, Layla stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her teeth. The steam from the shower still clung to the air, blurring the edges of the glass. She wiped it with the edge of her sleeve, staring at her reflection as if it held answers. Her face stared back, tired but otherwise normal. She leaned closer, inspecting her eyes for signs of the restless nights. The faintest flicker in the corner of the mirror made her freeze. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but her heart lurched as she caught it, a shadow moving in the hallway behind her. She turned sharply, her pulse racing. The hallway was empty. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, her voice unsteady. She rinsed her toothbrush and turned off the tap, but the unease clung to her like damp clothes. As she left the bathroom, she glanced back at the mirror one last time. The steam had begun to return, creeping up the glass, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw an outline in the fogged surface, vague, humanoid, and facing her. Becca had planned a movie night that evening, a way to pull Lila out of her spiral. She'd set up a blanket fort in the living room and ordered pizza, her excitement a sharp contrast to Lila's growing unease. They laughed and joked as they ate, the glow of the TV casting soft light around the room. "Okay, next one's a classic," Becca announced, holding up a DVD. "The kind of movie that makes you jump at every little noise." Lila forced a laugh. "That's exactly what I need right now." As the movie played, Lila found herself unable to focus. The flickering images on the screen seemed distant, her attention drawn instead to the edges of the room. The shadows near the hallway felt darker than usual, stretching and twisting in the corner of her vision. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, but the unease built with every passing second. "Hey, you okay?" Becca asked during a lull in the movie. Her voice was light, but her eyes were full of concern. "Yeah," Lila said quickly. "Just tired." Becca studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Let's call it a night after this one, okay?" "Okay," Lila agreed, though she wasn't sure if sleep would bring any comfort. That night, Lila lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The quiet of the apartment felt oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. She turned onto her side, her gaze drifting to the closet. The chair was still braced against the door, and the faint metallic smell had finally faded. But the memory of the knock, soft and deliberate, lingered in her mind. She rolled over, squeezing her eyes shut. Minutes passed, maybe hours, and slowly, sleep began to creep in. Just as she teetered on the edge of unconsciousness, the sound came again. A faint creak. Layla's eyes flew open, her body tensing. The noise was subtle, barely audible, but unmistakable. She lay still, listening intently, her heart pounding. Another creak followed, then another, each one closer than the last. It wasn't coming from the closet this time. It was coming from the hallway. Her breath quickened, her body frozen as the sounds continued. They weren't hurried or frantic. They were slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking toward her room. The faint shuffle of movement reached her ears, and her chest tightened. "Becca," she whispered, her voice trembling. No response. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. Lila's hand crept toward her phone on the nightstand, her fingers fumbling for the device. She unlocked it with shaking hands and opened her messages, her vision blurring as she typed. "Are you awake? There's something in the hallway." She hit send, staring at the door as she waited for a reply. Seconds passed, then her phone buzzed. "What are you talking about? I'm in my room." Lila's blood ran cold. Her door creaked softly, the faintest movement pulling it open just an inch. She stared at the gap, her breath caught in her throat, unable to look away. The darkness beyond the door seemed to pulse, alive and waiting. The morning after the hallway incident was oddly calm. Lila sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched bowl of cereal. The sunlight streaming through the window was bright, almost too bright, washing everything in an unnatural warmth that did nothing to ease the cold knot in her chest. Becca shuffled into the room, her hair messy from sleep and her oversized sweatshirt slipping off one shoulder. She poured herself a mug of coffee, her movements slow and unbothered. "You're up early," she said, glancing at Lila as she took a sip. Lila nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "Couldn't sleep." Becca frowned, setting her mug down. "You've been saying that a lot lately. What's going on?" Lila hesitated. She wanted to tell Becca everything: the creaking footsteps, the shadow in the mirror, the door that had opened just a crack. But every time she tried to form the words, they sounded ridiculous in her head. Instead, she gave a weak smile and shrugged. "Just stressed, I guess." Becca didn't press, though the concern in her eyes lingered. "Maybe you need to get out for a bit. A change of scenery could help." "Maybe," Lila replied, though the thought of leaving the apartment didn't feel as comforting as it should have. The day passed quietly, the hours stretching into an oppressive stillness. Lila tried to focus on mundane tasks, cleaning the bathroom, organizing the bookshelves, but her mind kept drifting. She kept glancing at the hallway, her ears straining for any sound. It remained silent, but the tension in the air was palpable, as though the apartment itself was holding its breath. By mid-afternoon, she decided to take Becca's advice. She grabbed her coat and left, the crisp autumn air biting against her cheeks as she wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood. The streets were quiet, the occasional hum of a passing car the only sound. It should have been peaceful, but the unease followed her, clinging to her like a shadow. She ended up at a small park on the edge of town, its paths winding through clusters of trees. The golden leaves crunched under her feet as she walked, the sound oddly satisfying. For a brief moment, she felt herself relax. The open sky, the rustling of the wind, it all felt normal, grounding. But as she rounded a bend in the path, she stopped abruptly. Ahead, a man was standing in the middle of the trail, his back to her. He was still, too still, his head tilted slightly to one side, as though listening for something. Lila's heart quickened. She considered turning back, but the man suddenly moved, his head snapping upright as if sensing her presence. He didn't turn around. Instead, he walked off the path and disappeared into the trees. Lila stood frozen for a moment, her breath shallow. The logical part of her brain told her it was nothing, just a random person taking a shortcut. But something about the way he moved, the sharpness, the unnatural precision, set her nerves on edge. When she returned home, the apartment was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Becca wasn't back yet, and the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Layla locked the door behind her and hung up her coat, her eyes immediately darting to the hallway. The chair was still in place, pressed against the closet door. It hadn't moved, but the sight of it didn't bring the comfort it used to. She walked past it quickly, trying to shake the prickling sensation creeping up her spine. That night, Becca came home late, her arms full of groceries and a cheerful energy that felt out of place against the heavy silence of the apartment. She insisted on cooking dinner, filling the kitchen with the smell of garlic and herbs as she talked about her day. Lila nodded along, grateful for the noise, even if she wasn't fully listening. But as they ate, she found herself glancing at the hallway again, her appetite fading. "Okay, seriously, what's going on?" Becca said, setting her fork down. "You've been weird all week." "I'm fine," Lila said automatically, though her voice wavered. Becca crossed her arms. "You're not. If something's wrong, just tell me." Lila hesitated, her eyes darting to the hallway again. "It's nothing, just the apartment. It's been feeling strange." "Strange how?" Becca asked, her tone softening. Lila shrugged, trying to find the right words. "Noises, shadows, like someone's here when they're not." Becca frowned but didn't dismiss her. "Maybe it's just stress, or the building settling." "Maybe," Lila said, though she didn't believe it. Later that night, as they settled in for bed, Lila felt a faint sense of relief, knowing Becca was just down the hall. She kept her door open, the faint glow of the hallway light spilling into her room. It wasn't much, but it helped. For a while, everything was still. The faint hum of the city outside, the occasional creak of the building, it all blended into a familiar background noise. And then, just as she was drifting off, "Shh," the whisper of her name sent a shiver down Lila's spine, her breath catching in her throat. She lay frozen in her bed, her heart pounding so violently it felt like it might burst from her chest. The hallway was still, but the silence was no longer empty. It was alive, humming with the weight of something unseen. "Becca," she called out again, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer, just the suffocating stillness pressing down on her. Slowly, she sat up, her fingers gripping the edge of her blanket. Her eyes remained locked on the doorway, the dim light spilling from the hall now seeming faint and distant, as though the apartment had stretched impossibly large. The whisper replayed in her mind, soft and intimate, like someone leaning close to her ear. Lila's phone was on the nightstand, but her hand froze halfway to it. The air had shifted, thick and icy, and she felt it before she saw it, the faintest movement in the hallway. A shadow, long and stretched, creeping just into view at the edge of her doorframe. She sucked in a sharp breath, her body tense with terror. The shadow wasn't static. It quivered, as if swaying, its edges unnatural and jagged. Lila's mind screamed at her to run, to move, but her legs felt like lead. She could only watch as the shadow deepened, thickening into something more. And then it stepped into the room. It wasn't human, not fully. Its form was warped, its limbs too long and thin, its head tilting unnaturally to one side. Its face, or where its face should have been, was a void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to pull the light from the room. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring her fear. Lila scrambled backward, her back hitting the wall with a thud. The creature paused, its head tilting further, as if it were listening to the sound of her breathing. Her fingers fumbled for her phone, finally closing around it. She hit the power button, the screen lighting up her face and casting a faint glow across the room. The creature recoiled slightly, its form shuddering as the light touched it. The reaction was small, but enough to give her a sliver of hope. Without thinking, she turned on the flashlight, the beam piercing the darkness and landing on the figure. It hissed, or at least, that was the closest sound Lila could describe. It was low and guttural, a noise that vibrated through the walls and into her bones. The creature staggered back, its limbs twisting as though it were trying to escape the light. Lila didn't hesitate. She bolted from the bed, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor as she sprinted toward the door. She didn't dare look back, her only focus on reaching Becca's room at the other end of the hall. "Becca!" she screamed, sat up in bed, her eyes wide with confusion and alarm. "What's going on?" Becca demanded, her voice groggy but tinged with fear. "There's something," Lila gasped, her words tumbling out incoherently. "In the hallway. It's here. It's in the apartment." Becca's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Lila, what are you—" Before she could finish, the doorknob rattled. Both women froze, their eyes snapping to the door. The sound was slow, deliberate, as though whatever was outside was testing the lock. Becca shot out of bed, her face pale. "What the hell is that?" "I told you," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. "It's here." The rattling stopped. For a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Then, with a deafening crack, the door shuttered, the wood splintering slightly as though something heavy had slammed into it. Becca screamed, grabbing Lila's arm and pulling her toward the window. "We have to get out." Lila hesitated, her mind racing. The window led to the fire escape, but it felt impossibly far. The thought of leaving the fragile barrier of the room sending a fresh wave of panic through her. But another crack of the door snapped her out of it. They wrestled the window open, the cold night air rushing in. Becca climbed out first, her movements frantic as she reached for the metal ladder. Lila followed, glancing back just as the door gave way. The creature stood in the doorway, its form barely contained by the frame. Its head tilted again, that same unnatural movement, as it stepped into the room. The swirling void of its face seemed to pulse, drawing the air from the space around it. "Go!" Becca shouted from the ladder, her voice breaking through Lila's paralysis. Layla scrambled onto the fire escape, her hands gripping the icy railing as she climbed down. She didn't dare look up, her only focus on the ground below. When her feet hit the pavement, she turned to see Becca already running toward the street. The two of them didn't stop until they were several blocks away, their breaths ragged and their bodies trembling. The sun was rising when Layla and Becca finally stopped running. They sat on a bench in a quiet park, their breaths ragged and visible in the cold morning air. Neither of them spoke for a long time, the silence filled only by the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird waking to a new day. Layla stared at her hands, her fingers trembling despite the warmth of her jacket. The events of the night felt like a fever dream, too surreal to be real, yet too vivid to be anything else. She glanced at Becca, whose pale face and wide, glassy eyes mirrored her own turmoil. "What the hell just happened?" Becca finally whispered, her voice cracking. Lila shook her head. "I don't know." The words felt hollow. She wanted to offer an explanation, a rationalization, anything that might make the last few hours less terrifying. But there was nothing. Becca exhaled shakily, running a hand through her hair. "That thing, it wasn't—" She paused, struggling to find the words. "It wasn't human, was it?" "No," Lila said softly. "I don't think it was." They sat in silence again, the weight of the admission settling over them like a heavy fog. The park felt impossibly still, the early morning light doing little to ease the darkness they carried with them. By mid-morning, they found themselves in a coffee shop near the edge of town. The warmth of the space and the hum of casual conversation were almost enough to lull them into a fragile sense of normalcy. They sat at a corner table, the untouched cups of coffee between them growing cold. "What do we do now?" Becca asked, her voice low but urgent. "We can't go back to the apartment. That thing, it's still there." Lila hesitated, her mind racing. The thought of returning to the apartment made her stomach churn, but leaving everything behind felt impossible. "Maybe we can stay somewhere else, a hotel, just for a few nights." Becca nodded slowly. Yeah, that's a good idea. Just for a little while." But the plan felt thin, like it wouldn't hold dogs across the street. The world outside seemed normal, untouched by the nightmare they had escaped. It made the memory of the creature feel even more surreal, and yet the sensation of being watched lingered. Even here, in the bright, bustling coffee shop, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were just a little too deep, the air just a little too cold. The hotel was small and unassuming, the kind of place that blended into the background of any city. They checked in with little fanfare, the receptionist barely glancing up as they handed over their IDs. The room was plain but clean, the twin beds neatly made with crisp white sheets. Becca dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto one of the beds, letting out a long sigh. I don't think I've ever been this tired. Lila sat on the edge of the other bed, her body heavy with exhaustion. We'll figure it out tomorrow, she said, though she wasn't sure what there was to figure out. Her mind felt frayed, the edges of her thoughts unraveling with every passing second. They both fell asleep quickly, the weight of the night's events dragging them into a restless slumber. Layla woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She blinked groggily, the room bathed in the soft orange glow of the setting sun. Becca was still asleep, her breaths slow and even. Lila reached for her phone, squinting at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. Did you think you could escape? Her blood turned to ice. She sat up sharply, her heart pounding as she stared at the message. Before she could react, another message came through. The mirror is waiting. She dropped the phone as if it had burned her, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She turned to wake Becca, but froze when she noticed something on the wall across from the beds. A faint shadow, long and distorted, stretched across the room. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't Becca's. Lila's heart sank as the shadow began to move, twisting and shifting unnaturally, like it was reaching for her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. From the darkness of the corner, a familiar low whisper filled the room. Her name,